Welcome to Math with Mr. J. In this video, I'm going to cover fraction word problems. We will have an addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division section. We will start with addition. Let's jump into number 1, where we have James walked his dog 2/5 of a mile in the morning and 1/3 of a mile in the afternoon. What fraction of a mile did James walk his dog in total that day? So here we need to add to find our answer. We need to take the distances, the morning and the afternoon, and combine them in order to find the total distance. So 2/5 of a mile in the morning plus 1/3 of a mile in the afternoon. Now, taking a look at this problem, we do not have a common denominator, so we need to find one in order to add. So we need a common denominator for 5 and 3 in order to add these fractions. 15 is going to be the lowest common denominator here between 5 and 3. So let's rename these fractions with that common denominator. So our next step here is to rename these fractions with that common denominator of 15. And remember, these are going to be equivalent fractions once we rename, so we're not changing the value of our original fractions. Let's start by renaming 2/5. We know that 5 times 3 gives us that denominator of 15. So whatever we do to the denominator, we must do to the numerator in order to keep this equivalent. So we need to do 2 times 3. 2 times 3 gives us 6. That's our numerator. 6/15 is our renamed fraction with the denominator of 15. Now we need to rename 1/3. 3 times 5 gives us that denominator of 15. So whatever we do to the denominator, we must do to the numerator in order to keep this equivalent. So we need to do 1 times 5. That gives us a numerator of 5. So our renamed fraction here is 5/15. Now that we have a common denominator, we are able to add. So we do 6 plus 5. That gives us a numerator of 11, and we keep the denominator of 15 the same. And this is the total distance walked that day. James walked his dog 11/15 of a mile. Now 11/15 is in simplest form, so we do not need to simplify here. Let's move on to number 2, where we have a chef will be using 1/8 of a cup of Parmesan cheese and 3/4 of a cup of cheddar cheese for a recipe. How much cheese will be used in total? The cheeses are being combined into this recipe. We need to find the total by adding. So we need to do 1/8 of a cup of Parmesan cheese plus 3/4 of a cup of cheddar cheese. We do not have a common denominator, so that's what we need to do first in order to add. The lowest common denominator for 8 and 4 is 8. So let's rename both of these fractions with that denominator, and then we can add. So again, our lowest common denominator is 8 here, so let's rename these. Let's start with 1/8, which that already has a denominator of 8. So we do not need to rename 1/8. Now for 3/4. Well, we know 4 times 2 gives us that denominator of 8. Whatever we do to the denominator, we must do to the numerator in order to keep this equivalent. 3 times 2 gives us 6. So 6/8 is our renamed fraction. Now we have a common denominator, so we can add. Let's add the numerators. 1 plus 6 gives us 7, and then we keep the denominator of 8. So our answer here, 7/8. 7/8 of a cup of cheese will be used for this recipe. That's the total amount of cheese used in this recipe. And 7/8 is in simplest form, so we do not need to simplify here. So those were our multiplication examples. Let's move on to division. So here are our subtraction examples. Let's jump into number 1, where we have Caleb hiked 1/2 of the trail. AJ hiked 4/5 of the trail. How much more of the trail did AJ hike than Caleb? We are finding the difference between the amount of the trail Caleb hiked and the amount of the trail AJ hiked. Whenever we find the difference between two values, we subtract. Now, AJ hiked more of the trail, so that's the fraction that's going to come first. 4/5 is greater than 1/2. So we need to do 4/5 minus 1/2. Now, we do not have a common denominator here, so we can't subtract quite yet. We need to find a common denominator for 5 and 2, and then we can subtract. 10 is going to be our lowest common denominator between 5 and 2. So let's rename these with that common denominator of 10. Now keep in mind, these are going to be equivalent fractions once we rename them. So we're not changing the value of our original fractions. Let's start by renaming 4/5. We know that 5 times 2 gives us that denominator of 10. Whatever we do to the denominator, we must do to the numerator in order to keep this equivalent. So 4 times 2. That gives us 8. Our renamed fraction with the denominator of 10 is 8/10. And again, this is an equivalent fraction, so we're not changing the value of anything here. Now for 1/2. We know that 2 times 5 gives us that denominator of 10. Whatever we do to the denominator, we must do to the numerator in order to keep this equivalent. So we need to do 1 times 5. That gives us 5. So our renamed fraction here is 5/10. Now we are ready to subtract since we have a common denominator. So we'll start by subtracting the numerators. 8 minus 5 gives us 3. And then we keep our denominator of 10. So our answer is 3/10. So to answer the question, how much more of the trail did AJ hike than Caleb? Well, 3/10 of the trail. Now, 3/10 is in simplest form, so we do not need to simplify here. Now let's move on to number 2, where we have Ava had 7/8 of a gallon of paint. She used 2/3 of a gallon for a home project. How much paint does Ava have left? So Ava started with 7/8 of a gallon of paint and then used 2/3 of a gallon. So we are subtracting here. We're starting with 7/8 of a gallon and subtracting 2/3 of a gallon to see how much paint is left. Now, do we have a common denominator here? No, so we can't subtract yet. So we need to find a common denominator and rename these fractions with that common denominator. The lowest common denominator for 8 and 3 is 24. So let's rename both of these fractions with that common denominator of 24. We'll start with 7/8. We know that 8 times 3 gives us that denominator of 24. That means we need to multiply the numerator by 3 as well in order to keep this equivalent. 7 times 3 gives us 21. So 21/24 is our renamed fraction. Now for 2/3. We know that 3 times 8 gives us 24. So we need to do that to the numerator as well in order to keep this equivalent. 2 times 8 gives us 16. So 16/24 is our renamed fraction. And now both fractions have been renamed with that common denominator of 24. So we have a common denominator here. We can subtract now. Let's start with the numerators. 21 minus 16 gives us 5. And then we keep our denominator of 24 the same. So we get 5/24. So to answer the question, how much paint does Ava have left? Well, 5/24 of a gallon. And 5/24 is in simplest form. So there's our subtraction section. Let's move on to multiplication. So here are our multiplication examples. Let's jump into number 1, where we have 5/6 of all students at Stone Rock University are currently taking a math class. Of those students, 1/3 are taking a math class online. What fraction of all students at Stone Rock University are taking a math class online? So, thinking through this, we know that 5/6 of all students are taking a math class right now. 1/3 of those students are taking their math class online. So, we need to find 1/3 of 5/6. Now, whenever we are finding the fraction of something, we can multiply in order to find that answer. So we can replace of with a multiplication sign here. So 1/3 times 5/6 will give us our answer. Again, 1/3 of the students taking math classes are taking those classes online. So we need 1/3 of 5/6. And we're multiplying in order to find that answer. Remember, when we multiply fractions, we multiply straight across. So numerator times numerator and denominator times denominator. Let's start with the numerators. So 1 times 5. That gives us 5. And then for the denominators, we have 3 times 6. That gives us 18. So we end up with 5/18. That's the fraction of all students at Stone Rock University taking a math class online. So we can label this 5/18 of the students. Now 5/18 is in simplest form, so we are done. Let's move on to number 2, where we have Anne walks 3/10 of a mile each day for exercise. How many miles does she walk in 1 week? So if we think about how to solve this, well, we have 7 days in a week. So we have 7 days of walking 3/10 of a mile. 7 groups of 3/10, in other words. So we can solve this by doing 7 times 3/10. So 7, and I'm going to write 7 as a fraction by putting it over 1. That way we have a numerator and a denominator, and we can multiply straight across. So 7 over 1, which again, that is equal to 7. So we're not changing the value of anything. We're just writing 7 as a fraction. Times 3/10. And now we can multiply straight across. So 7 times 3, that gives us 21. And then 1 times 10, that gives us 10. And we end up with 21/10. Now 21/10 is an improper fraction. So let's convert this to a mixed number. And we do this by dividing the numerator, 21, by the denominator, 10. So 21 divided by 10. How many whole groups of 10 are in 21? Well, 2. 2 is our whole number of the mixed number. That gets us to 20. So we have a remainder of 1. That's our numerator of the fractional part. Over, and then we keep our denominator of 10 the same. So we end up with 2 and 1/10. Looking at the original question, how many miles does she walk in 1 week? So we have 2 and 1/10 miles. Lastly, let's move on to number 3, where we have there are 21 students in Professor Hall's biology class. 2/7 of the class earned an A on the final exam. How many students earned an A? Well, we need to find 2/7 of 21. 2/7 of 21. So 2/7 times 21. And I'm writing 21 over 1. I'm writing 21 in fractional form. That way we have a numerator and a denominator, and we can multiply straight across. Now let's multiply. 2 times 21 gives us 42, and then 7 times 1 gives us 7. So we end up with 42/7, which is an improper fraction. So let's convert this to a mixed number. We need to divide the numerator, 42, by the denominator, 7. 42 divided by 7 gives us 6. And we hit 42 exactly. We don't have a remainder. So we end up with a whole number here. 6 is our answer. So how many students earned an A? 6 students. So those were our multiplication examples. Let's move on to division. So here are our division examples. Let's jump into number 1, where we have Lewis has 2/3 of a gallon of paint. Each wall he is painting requires 1/4 of a gallon of paint. How many walls can Lewis paint? If he needs to paint 4 walls, does he have enough paint? So thinking through this problem, Lewis is starting with 2/3 of a gallon of paint, and he is splitting or dividing that paint into groups of 1/4 of a gallon. Each wall needs 1/4 of a gallon. So we need to do 2/3 divided by 1/4. That's going to tell us how many walls Lewis can paint and if he has enough for 4 walls. Now remember, when we divide fractions, we keep, switch, flip. So we keep the first fraction. Then we switch to multiplication and flip our second fraction. So 4 is now the numerator and 1 is now the denominator. Now we can multiply straight across. So the numerator times numerator and denominator times denominator. 2 times 4 gives us 8, and 3 times 1 gives us 3. So we end up with 8/3, which is an improper fraction. So let's convert this to a mixed number. And we do this by dividing the numerator, 8, by the denominator, 3. So we need to do 8 divided by 3. So how many whole groups of 3 in 8? Well, 2. So 2 is our whole number. That gets us to 6. So we have a remainder here. We have a remainder of 2. That's our numerator of the fractional part. And then we keep our denominator the same. So we get 2 and 2/3. So how many walls can Lewis paint? Well, 2 and 2/3. So not quite 3 walls. So this is our answer here. Now, can Lewis paint 4 walls? Does he have enough paint? No. So let's put no. He does not have enough paint. Let's move on to number 2, where we have a baker is making cupcakes. He has 15 cups of sugar. Each batch of cupcakes requires 3/4 of a cup of sugar. How many batches can he make? So what we need to do here, the baker is starting with 15 cups of sugar, and he's splitting or dividing those 15 cups of sugar into groups of 3/4 of a cup of sugar. So we need to do 15 divided by 3/4. So let's keep, and I'm going to rewrite 15 in fractional form. So I'm putting it over 1. That way we have a numerator and a denominator. This still equals 15, so we're not changing the value of 15 here. So keep, switch, and then flip. So 4/3. And now we can multiply. Let's start with the numerators. So we have 15 times 4. That gives us 60. Now for the denominators, 1 times 3, that gives us 3. And we end up with 60/3, which is an improper fraction. So let's convert this to a mixed number by dividing the numerator 60 by the denominator 3. So we need to do 60 divided by 3. That gives us 20. And we do not have a remainder. This is just going to be a whole number here. So our answer is 20. How many batches can he make? 20 batches. Lastly, let's move on to number 3, where we have Gwen has 1/2 of a bag of soil. She wants to split it evenly among 8 pots. What fraction of the bag will each pot receive? So in order to solve this, we know that Gwen has 1/2 of a bag of soil, and she's splitting it or dividing it among 8 pots. So Gwen is starting with half a bag and dividing it between 8 pots. So let's keep, switch, flip here. So keep 1/2, switch to multiplication, and then we need to flip 8. So let's write 8 in fractional form by putting it over 1, and now we can flip it. So 1 is our numerator and 8 is our denominator. Now we can multiply. So the numerators, 1 times 1 gives us 1. And then for the denominators, 2 times 8 gives us 16. So our answer here, 1/16. Looking back at the original question, what fraction of the bag will each pot receive? Well, 1/16 of the bag. So there you have it. Those were some examples of fraction word problems. I hope that helped. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, peace.